To FinTech Festival India's Bengaluru Micro Experience, everybody. Our next session talks about the critical data security measures for FinTech and the roadmap ahead. Joining us on this discussion, we have Mr. Prakash, Senior Business Development Manager, Banking and Enterprise, India, Thales Group, who will also be moderating this session. Joining Ved on this panel, we have Mr. Ajay, Garga, Member Face and VP Technology with mPokket, Mr. Sujay Vasudevan, Head of Risk and Compliance with M2P FinTech, and Prashanth A, Regional Business Manager with Thales Group India. With that, over to you, Ved. The panel is all yours.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And I welcome all the panel members for having an exciting, informative session on really a very important piece would be on the data security measures that one need to look at to address the emerging threat landscape. And with FinTechs, which are new age organizations which have come up with use of most new age technologies like AI and ML, and having the journey in cloud, or some of them are already cloud native, they also possess a significant risk pertaining to the data that users data that is being residing with them. And with rise of this ransomware and data breaches that we hear, how can FinTech address these through appropriate measures or technology interventions would be the focus for me to discuss with the panelists out here. And I would start with the first question to Ajay to understand what are the security risk in cloud and how do you think would be the technology controls to address those risks for data residing in cloud?
So thanks for bringing up this question. It's a need of the hour, like you mentioned. Definitely, all the companies moving toward digitalization, as well as FinTech being very crucial and very handling all the users' sensitive data and so on. It's a need of the hour. So I will say the first step could be to first categorize the data into multiple buckets, right? Or what do you see? What kind of data it is, and identify how crucial is this and so on as well. To start with a simple example of a phone number or email, right? In India, till now it's not very sensitive. If somebody asks for your phone number, we immediately give that number. But there are a lot of things going on currently, how people can misuse your phone number or email as well, right? So we need to categorize the data in the first place, and then we need to see what needs to be exposed to our internal users and internal system administrators and developers and so on as well. And then we talk about exposing this to our customers in what kind of application it is. It can be mobile applications or web applications and so on. And then with partners who have our trusted partners, we do integrate with them in the different forms. And then comes the last aspect, who are outside our system and should not have access to our data at all, right?
Correct.
So we need to categorize this in the first place, and then we talk about how do we do
so that means, Ajay, the data discovery and classification would be the first step that one needs to really take up to understand where the sensitive data is, and then what to do with the sensitive data and what technology controls then need to be addressed. If it is being shared with third parties, should we tokenize the data, or if it is mask the data, or if it is within the users, we define an access for control around that data and use of technologies which would enable that. Perfect. And especially just one more pointer that how do you think would the security measures in cloud really needs to be looked upon? Because when it is with cloud service provider, definitely at one point of time, the lot of ownership would be with them for your data. How do you think you can also definitely take certain controls over it?
Yeah, so again a good question. Now almost all the applications are on the cloud. Either we go with public cloud or private cloud and so on, right? So here I see a bit of a challenge. Even though we go with the cloud providers, they provide you a lot of configuration, but still the ownership still lies with the company who is owning that data.
Correct.
Right? So I see a lot of breaches that happen majorly because the cloud providers are complicated or provided a lot of functionality, a lot of ways we can control what level of security we want and so on. So again, we need to understand what the system is offering you, the cloud provider is offering you, and then as the data categorization that we have done, then we need to use the find control and see what exactly we need to do and so on as well, right? So again, there are two parts. One is on the infrastructure level, what the cloud provider is offering you the security, and then at the application level, what is that we are offering as a security as well. That's where you mentioned about roles and permissions, what kind of data we expose to our customers, partners, and so on. Whether we have a short-lived token-based assets, or we provide them a masked data, and so on as well, right? So it's not a very straightforward answer for this. Cloud providers provide a lot of opportunity, a lot of configuration. So based on the categorization plus the offering from the cloud, we need to address it accordingly. And then application is definitely, it's purely in the individual companies control how they want to do it and so on as well.
Absolutely, Ajay. Perfect. Absolutely right. And this immediately strikes me to the Prashanth, you being from the solution player who is tackling these kind of challenges for fintechs and large enterprises. Yes. I would like to understand what would be the immediate use cases that Thales solution are addressing for the fintech organizations, and where exactly you see the contribution in data protection really being happening.
That's a very relevant question, Ved. I'll just pick up a couple of points what Ajay just mentioned and drive your focus back to them. Top 3 use cases if you see in banking and fintechs. One is definitely the data protection through encryption and key management. There is no negotiation on that because RBI clearly says that whatever falls under the gamut, regulated and non-regulated entities, they have to protect the PCI and PI data without any compromise. That's point number 1, first use case. The second one, as Ajay just mentioned, the cloud security. So fintechs mostly, they are migrating their data into public cloud, and they really do not have a control over, at least some of the fintechs, they don't have control over what's happening within the cloud. Is there an insider threat? Is there some other competitor who's just lurking into it and watching your data? You do not have a control over it. So there's a concept called BYOK, which is not coined by solution providers like us. It is something coined by the public cloud providers themselves. It is very much essential to make sure the customer gets the control over their keys, the encrypted keys, which further takes them to the BYOE, which is bring your own encryption, for a higher heightened security of data. The third use case, and the most important for fintechs, is that most of the fintechs are into the payment gateway space, and they are into the transactions in and out. So let's take an example of a POS provider, right, where you swipe your card. You have a POS machine provider who's somebody who's entirely different from the acquisition bank or the issuing bank. So from the time I swipe my card as a consumer, the PIN translation is happening over from the POS machine to the acquirer bank, to the EMV, and to the issuing bank.
Correct.
Every time the PIN travels from one place to another place, we call it as a zone. We take 2 subsequent entities as a zone. You need to have the PIN protection there. The most important thing that you need is a payment HSM there, which Thales is pretty much into. Almost major chunk of our revenue comes from there. So these are the top 3 use cases that I can come across for the fintechs.
Absolutely makes sense, Prashanth, and I very well find a substantial value from the initiatives that you called it out in terms of the role of encryption, the role of bring your own key for cloud environment, and definitely on the payment HSMs being one of the very important solution to address all this security related to the transactions and PIN security. Great. So now I will come, Sujay, on you, and you being heading the risk management practice. I would like to understand, where do you see this approach really working for fintech organizations? Is it mostly driven by the regulation side, or is it most on the proactive side with adherence to best practices that is defining the approach in the organizations today?
Yeah, thanks, Ved. And that's a very interesting question, right? And the reason for that is we are in an age where technology is changing, business cases are changing rapidly, innovation is happening at a very, very fast pace. And also, a lot of players, fintechs, are also experimenting with new things, right? New ways of doing things, new ways of transmitting data. And regulation is, kind of catching up as well.
Absolutely.
Right? So my point is, regulation will always look at what's best for the consumer, for the person who's user or the customer, and it's always going to be a watch and intervene if required approach by any regulator, right? And there's some phenomenal work being done by the regulator, but I think a lot of self-governance is also required. Because as our systems get more complicated, as we connect to multiple parties, as we go more cloud, technically the attack surface also becomes that much more bigger.
Correct.
And there are going to be blind spots. There are going to be, you're not only targeted, and I think you mentioned that, saying that you're going to have what access does your employee have is an important one, because it could be the fact that it could be simple malware, keylogger, and just because you've exposed some data that employee has got, I mean the fraudster or the cyber criminal has got access. So I think it's a bit of both. There has to be a lot of self-governance. There has to be layers of security, not just on protecting the data or encrypting or using keys, but also in terms of active monitoring, security by design in whatever you're developing. And I think it's very, very holistic, and it's important that when we are getting into a place where we're handling money which belongs to someone else, the sense of responsibility also needs to come along with that. I mean, I would quote Spider-Man, but I think you know where I'm heading.
Absolutely. Right? No, quite true, Sujay. And I think, yes, the basic approach in terms of the defining a governance framework, and as you rightly said, privacy by design, which is a new way to really structure that security has to be in the beginning rather than an afterthought process, shapes up to tackle the emerging challenges. So great. I will again come back to you, Prashanth, before I come to Ajay. Primarily in terms of addressing one key area related to encryption.
Yeah.
How do you see that being helpful against the ransomware attacks that are currently being a major pain for a lot of organizations? And how do, from your experience with customers, you've seen that as a preventive measure to address this kind of threat?
So Ved, it's a good question. Let me answer it in two different ways. One is the preventive control. The other one is monitoring controls, as Sujay just mentioned. So both are required for an organization. If you have a data center, of course, you have monitoring controls like PIM, PAM, DAM, SIEM to alert you priority-wise as and when an attack is happening. But if you take ransomware right now, all these are zero-day attacks. You don't have a signature, basically, to compare it with. And there's a saying in security, whatever you cannot prevent, you have to monitor. Whatever you cannot monitor, you have to prevent that. In this case, preventive tools take a front seat in terms of protecting your critical sensitive data. Let's say you are locking it with a 256-bit AES encryption. No other party, I mean, a supercomputer takes 3,000 years to decrypt that with an AES 256. It's a gold standard encryption, right? So how many other monitoring tools you have in place, you definitely need to have a preventive backup somewhere. And there is no other preventive backup other than your encryption and tokenization. It has to be backed up by a key management solution. Especially when ransomware attacks, if you see, you can't trace the trajectory of these attacks. It just attacks one system in the organization, let it be a spear phishing or it could be a larger attack. It just traverses from one system to another system. By the time you track the trajectory of the ransomware, the damage would have already happened.
Correct.
So major organizations nowadays, I don't want to take names, some of the biggest names that you see in the newspapers last year, all are hit by ransomwares, and some of them are brilliantly protected because they have encryption in place. The attackers could not do anything with the encrypted data. So let that be leakware, let that be cryptoware, they were not able to crack these companies. So these points are very much in line with RBI guidelines or your CERT-in, which says that within 6 hours of the breach you have to go and report. And things like data discovery, you have to know what your data is and where it is, basically, to prevent these kind of attacks.
Yeah. Very, very well defined in terms of measures to tackle this ransomware through preventive control. Thanks, Prashanth, for that pointer. I will come to you now, Ajay, especially on two things which one Prashanth said is adhering to this certain time mandate which recently has come to notify the data breach within 6 hours. How do you think organizations should have the preparedness to really meet such an ask? And what, according to you, would really kind of align with managing this ask from certain, or with respect to any other compliance fulfillment that comes on notifying the data breaches?
Yeah, so this is again definitely a need of the hour. It cannot be taken as a reactive method. It has to be there, taken in the first place itself, as he was mentioning, that with greater responsibility comes more responsibility with managing the customer data as well. So in the first place, we should be aware of where we stand as of today, even before RBI or anybody else come and say that, hey, this is we are going to make this as a mandatory regulation going forward. We should be aware where we stand as of today. So we should be constantly monitoring from application point of view as well as from infrastructure point of view, where we stand today in terms of security, in terms of compliance and so on. And so that when before even it becomes a mandate, we know where we are lagging, right? So that should be the first step. And it should be a continuous activity. I see a lot of regulations coming up like GDPR, ISO certification and so on. It should not be an activity that we do once in 6 months or once in 1 year just for giving a certification, but it should be a continuous activity where we keep monitoring all of our applications and infrastructure continuously, and then see where we lag and how do we get an alert if something is getting attacked immediately and so on as well, right? I see a lot of companies have started doing this with variety of tools now coming into play. Just giving an example, we always protect our even from a house point of view, you will always be looking up from the front door, right? But the attack can happen from the back door as well. So I have seen companies who have been taking care of the how attackers can get into our system. They have protected a very clean way of securing that. But for some reason, if the attack has happened and they are already into the system, then what is the next step, right? That's where the encryption comes into play. Earlier we have been lagging there, assuming that nobody will get in. Now we know that there are ways to get in. Then the next step is what can they do with the data, right? Then I have seen that earlier outflow, what the users can do with the data into can they upload all of the data into their own system. That was not taken care very well. Now that is also being taken care.
Exactly, Ajay. So data-centric approach has become now the key focus area for organizations. And as you rightly said, it was more perimeter-centric, but now data has become the new perimeter.
Yeah.
And that's where from I would say edge to core, the journey needs to be looked upon from a holistic point of view to safeguard all the critical measures and meet all the key ask, whether it is notification of breaches or within the adherence of timeline that has been called out. Very, very well pointed out, and really helpful, I think, from the perspective of adhering to these timelines that organizations need to align with. I will come to you, Sujay, now. While Ajay called out with the emergence of this data privacy bill, something in lines with GDPR that we have seen very effectively for the European organization. How do you see that changing the security landscape within the organizations? And I would, from that perspective, across all the sectors, may not be just FinTech, but maybe with other organizations also, because that cut across the sectors. So how do you see that landscape changing?
I think if you look at it, I mean, we have always evolved, right? If you look at how as an organization, FinTechs in the country have evolved, we have embraced all such changes. So I think that's definitely a positive change that's going to come. It does look at a requirement for everyone to just go back to the drawing board as well, to see what kind of information you're actually collecting, how are you using it, whether there's permissions, handling it, sharing it. I think a lot of business models may be under threat. I think that's definitely one of the risks which are there with this bill. But I think overall, considering safeguarding the trust in the ecosystem, trust in payments, it's a very necessary measure. We have all seen very negative news over the last few years, and especially, as you said, with data breaches and ransomware hitting headlines, and data protection, privacy, data, personal data protection becomes fairly critical to kind of keep consumers protected and keep the trust in the system as well. So yeah, it's going to modify some businesses. It's going to be a lot of work for sure. but I think it's really good for our future.
And thanks for that. And where do you see, I think some time back even there has been a guideline from ministry to have a data governance process in place across the organization. So how will that also be effective in really shaping or addressing these data security and data protection measures within the organization?
So as I said, it's the governance architecture. I mean, to an extent, you have to define it yourself.
So that will drive the measures that has to be taken.
I mean, it would come under the umbrella for sure.
Umbrella for sure. Great.
And it's kind of like setting that framework up front, so that when the policies come in, you can start implementing further quickly.
Absolutely, very valid thoughts around that, Sujay. Thanks for that. Prashanth, I will come to you, and I think there is a major lack of understanding in terms of where do we use the general purpose HSMs that most of the organizations take with respect to the payment HSMs. And I would like to know the audiences for what's the real benefit or the difference, and how do we define the usage of general purpose versus payment HSM?
Well, Ved, to answer this question, I'll be OEM neutral here. Don't want to get into sales pitch here. So each segment of HSMs have a specific use. The algorithms used, the cryptography used, the firmware used is completely different. So right now we have general purpose HSMs, the segment which is being used for your UPIs, eKYC, ADV, your data, your document signing, etc., etc.
Correct.
So the algorithms and cryptography used in that is specific to these applications. Okay. We have an entire gamut of ecosystem which leverages our general purpose HSM to cater to the banking customers and FinTech customers. Wherein, when it comes to payment HSMs, this is specifically for the translation and the issuing use cases. There are companies which issue the cards who needs PIN translation. Of course, UPI is also transforming into payment HSM because it needs higher cryptographic computation right now. So based on the specific use cases, we have a separate segment of payment HSMs which we cater to. Just picking up the point from Sujay earlier, most of the FinTechs right now, they have migrated their data to the cloud, and they feel that, okay, the cloud provider is taking care of all the HSM requirement right now. It's a approach, it's like we will cross the bridge when we approach. So that approach would not work. Right? They need to take the ownership and see what all they need within the system.
Correct.
Than leaving it to the cloud provider. If you look at the CCM matrix, the cloud control matrix, only the cloud provider is going to take certain responsibility, keeping the key ownership, and especially the HSM stores the master key. That ownership is completely passed on to the customer. In case of a breach, they are not going to take that responsibility. So it's ultimately customer who needs to take that ownership, and payment HSM plays a larger role there.
Great. I think this will really help on terms of the understanding the differentiation part of it. And just one last question before I will come to Ajay, and then we'll wrap up the discussion would be, what would be the 3 pointers that one should really look at for a key management system adoption? Which defines a enterprise class scalable kind of technology to meet for managing the complete encryption and lifecycle of encryption keys.
So most of the organizations, let that be FinTechs, NBFCs, banking, they know encryption is necessary. They have native encryption enabled in some or other form. If they have applications on the cloud native encryption is already in place. What they lack is the key management here. What about insider threats? I'll just give you one example which bank has come up and said that their auditor pointed out this, it's a red flag there. The native encryption, if you keep the key within the vault, the database administrator at any point of time can switch on and switch off the encryption. There is no separation of duties there. This is a point pointed out by an auditor. They have kept it in red flag for one of the major banks. So an external key manager is always necessary. There should be a separation of duty between someone who's managing the database, someone who's owning the keys.
Absolutely.
Right. So that is where a key management comes into picture. And this is one of the major points. And the second point is that when organizations have their SIM tools or PIM-PAM tools, they have a continuous monitoring integrated. This key management has to be integrated with their SIM, right? To know who's logged in at what time, who's got access to what. If there is a breach of trust, it has to be immediately popped out in a priority 1 level. That is where the key management helps as well as an external key manager.
Amazing, absolutely. I think this is a very valid input and definitely helps us to know how key management would really be a very critical component as a business critical system, I would say, going forward for organizations to look into their data protection journey.
Yes.
So I think, Ajay, I would just come to you with one last question that comes to my mind is that how do you see the digital growth journey where the data privacy and data security both merge into each other? So which will come first? Will it be privacy or will it be security? So it's a tricky part, but definitely this is something which comes in mind when most of the discussions I've been doing, and your thoughts would definitely help us to know what should be the start and then where should be the way forward for it.
So this again a very good question. It's very relevant to the current world. Even everybody is questioning earlier how people were very passionate about Facebook and Google. Now they started questioning why Google and Facebook are getting our data in the first place. Right? So it's a very good, very relevant question as well. So to my mind, data privacy comes first because the end user, they should be aware of what the data the system or platform is getting from me and for why. Right, because the analytics come into play, the companies are ready to get as much as information from the users so that they can understand our behavior, they can do whatever they want, right? So the data is becoming the new oil, as they say.
Absolutely.
So first of all, the customer should be aware why the data is getting captured and how it is going to be used and so on. That is one of the things that is very much highlighted in the GDPR regulations as well. So I will say definitely the data privacy comes first, and once the data is collected, then comes the security on who is going to access this, how they are going to
privacy will lead to security, and that's how the absolutely bang on, and I think that would be the very right approach to take into consideration. So I think with this, we would like to thank all the eminent panelist members for sharing their wonderful views, and I hope the audiences would have benefited from some of the thoughts that have come out in the discussion. And I would like to wrap up our panel discussion now.